March 19, 1945. While American newspapers celebrated Allied victories across Europe, another war, quiet, invisible, and cruel, was being waged inside the bodies of young German women who had once served the Reich. It was a war fought not with rifles or artillery, but with emptiness, with stomachs that had forgotten the sensation of being full, and minds that moved sluggishly through the gray haze of starvation. Germany was collapsing. Railways were gone, cities turned to ash, and the once proud Wehrmacht was a desperate shadow of itself. The women of the auxiliary forces, the Nachrichtenhelferinnen who had worked as typists, radio operators, and medics, were now reduced to scavengers, picking through ruins for anything that could be chewed, swallowed, and kept down. For them, victory and defeat no longer mattered. Survival was the only mission left. 22-year-old Margaret Schultz had not tasted real meat in over a year and a half. She thought she still remembered its flavor, though sometimes she wondered if her memory was only mocking her, conjuring up phantom tastes to torment her hollow stomach. She and 37 other women had been captured near the Rhine while retreating east, their unit cut off by advancing American armor. They were exhausted, lice-ridden, and barely able to stand when the Americans found them crouched in a barn. For weeks, they had survived on handfuls of spoiled potatoes and a watery broth made from turnip peels. The strongest among them could still walk. The weakest had to be carried. Margaret's boots were worn thin, the soles patched with scraps of fabric, her once blonde hair now brittle and streaked with gray dust. Among the captured women was Anna Fisher, just 19, whose eyes seemed too large for her gaunt face. There was Elizabeth Hartman, a nurse who had once been known for her bright laughter, but who now spoke only when absolutely necessary. Hunger had stripped them all down to the same essence, fragile, frightened creatures suspended between duty and despair. They had learned to stop speaking of food. Once, during the early days of their retreat, they had whispered to each other about roasted goose and dumplings, about hot bread and butter, about Christmas tables that groaned under the weight of feasts long gone. But soon those conversations became unbearable, each word a fresh wound, so they fell silent. When American troops finally surrounded them, the women expected the worst. The propaganda had been clear. Americans were monsters, avengers who would show no mercy. As they were loaded onto transport trucks, Margaret's fear mingled with something unexpected: hope. Perhaps, she thought, even in captivity there might be food. The journey to the camp blurred into one long vibration of engines and exhaustion. The truck rattled through endless stretches of countryside, and through the torn canvas Margaret glimpsed something that made her breath catch: green. Lush living green. Fields, trees, grass untouched by bombs. It was the first color she had seen in months that wasn't the gray of ash or the brown of mud. Here, in this strange land, cows grazed lazily in pastures. Chickens pecked at the earth. The air itself smelled of life and abundance. For the German women, it was an almost unbearable contrast. They had come from a world where even weeds had become rations, where every creature that could be eaten had long since disappeared. When the truck finally lurched to a halt, sunlight stabbed through the open flap. The brightness was blinding. The women raised thin hands to shield their eyes as a voice shouted in accented English, "Out! Let's go!" They climbed down one by one, unsteady, blinking into the Georgia morning. Margaret stepped onto solid ground and swayed. Her knees almost buckled under her. Around her stretched a fenced compound, Camp Gordon, rows of barracks, clean gravel paths, and neat fences topped with barbed wire. But what struck her wasn't the fences. It was the order. The place was tidy, almost serene. There were no screaming guards, no snarling dogs. An American sergeant pointed them toward the intake building. His face was unreadable, neither cruel nor kind, just professional. The women shuffled forward, clutching what few belongings they had: a comb, a handkerchief, a photo from before the war. Inside, American nurses took their names. One of them, a red-haired corporal named Nancy Williams, handed each woman a tin cup of water. It was clear, cool, and real. Margaret drank greedily, tears welling as the liquid soothed her cracked lips and raw throat. When the first mess call sounded later that day, none of them knew what to expect. The truck jolted to a stop, throwing the exhausted women forward. For a moment, no one moved. Dust swirled in the golden Georgia sunlight that leaked through the torn canvas flaps. Marguerite Schultz blinked, dazed, her thin hands gripping the wooden bench for balance. The last 14 hours had felt like a fever dream. Endless rattling roads, the smell of diesel, the occasional bark of orders she didn't understand. When the rear flap opened and the sunlight hit her face, it felt too bright, too clean, too alive. After the gray ruins of Germany, this world seemed unreal. Out. Everyone out, came the English command, firm but not harsh. 2 American guards stood by the tailgate, their uniforms pressed, their boots polished, rifles slung casually over their shoulders. Margaret hesitated, expecting a shove, but none came. One of the guards even extended a hand to steady her as she stepped down. His touch was brief and professional, but the simple act startled her more than any threat could have. Before them, stretched Camp Gordon, rows of wooden barracks surrounded by neat fences, gravel paths, and guard towers. The air smelled of pine, cut grass, and something faintly sweet, a far cry from the smoke and decay that had clung to Germany's towns. For a moment, Marguerite forgot to be afraid. Then reality returned like a cold wind. This was a prison. She was a captured enemy, a German auxiliary from the Communications Corps, stripped of her purpose, her nation, and her future. A female officer approached, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. She carried herself with crisp authority, tan uniform, leather gloves, a clipboard tucked under one arm. Her face was composed, but her eyes, a pale blue, flickered with awareness. "I am Lieutenant Patricia Morrison," she said, her voice careful, her German fluent but accented. "Welcome to Camp Gordon. You will be processed, examined, and assigned quarters. Follow instructions and you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention." The women exchanged glances. Confusion, disbelief, suspicion. Geneva Convention sounded like something out of a distant world, a rule that could not possibly exist here. They had heard stories of American cruelty, of humiliation and starvation, of revenge disguised as justice. But Lieutenant Morrison's voice was calm, her tone precise, almost bureaucratic. She was not here to threaten them. She was here to organize them. The processing began in the medical barracks. The building smelled faintly of antiseptic and soap. Inside, an older camp doctor, gray-haired, gentle-faced, waited with a small team of medics. The women were instructed to undress behind screens and submit to examinations. For many it was a humiliation, but not the kind they expected. The doctor did not shout, did not leer. He worked quietly, taking notes, his brow furrowed in concern. When it was Margaret's turn, he placed a stethoscope against her chest. His hands were steady, his expression professional. She watched him write something on a form, his mouth tightening slightly as he spoke to his assistant in low English. She caught fragments: severe malnutrition, muscle loss, irregular heartbeat. Through an interpreter, he asked her a single question. "When was your last full meal?" Margaret opened her mouth, and nothing came. She could not remember, not truly. The days before their capture had been one long blur of hunger and exhaustion. Potato peels boiled into soup, a crust of bread shared among 3 women, a single bean chewed until it turned to dust. The doctor's pen paused mid-note, then resumed its slow scratching. His expression did not change, but there was pity in his eyes. After the examinations, the women were led to a row of wooden barracks surrounded by flowering trees and the faint hum of cicadas. Inside, the space was astonishingly clean. Simple cots with folded wool blankets, metal footlockers, even curtains on the windows. Margaret touched the fabric of the blanket as though it might vanish. It was coarse but warm. She hadn't seen such order in months. Around her, the other women sank onto their bunks, too stunned to speak. Anna Fisher sat on the edge of her bed, her eyes wide as she traced the seam of the mattress. Elizabeth Hartman, once the strongest among them, stared at the ceiling with tears silently slipping down her hollow cheeks. None of this felt real. It was too clean, too humane. There had to be a catch. The door creaked open. Lieutenant Morrison, stood framed in the sunlight, her clipboard now tucked under her arm. The women scrambled to their feet instinctively, backs straight, reflexes of discipline that war had not erased. At 1800 hours, Morrison said in her deliberate German, "You will proceed to the mess hall for your evening meal. Tonight, the cooks are serving beef stew, bread and coffee." Silence. The words hung in the air, incomprehensible. Beef. Real beef. Marguerite thought she had misheard. At precisely 1800 hours, the bell rang across Camp Gordon. The German women, 38 in total, filed out of their barracks in a slow, uncertain line. The evening air was warm and carried the scent of pine and something else, faint but unmistakable. A smell they had not encountered in years. Meat. Marguerite felt her breath catch as the aroma drifted closer with every step. It was rich and savory, layered with herbs and something buttery. For a moment she wondered if she was imagining it, if her starved mind had conjured the scent out of desperation. But then she saw the smoke rising from the mess hall chimney, real thick cooking smoke, and her legs trembled. The women entered the building, their boots echoing softly on the wooden floor. The mess hall was enormous, brightly lit, rows of long tables stretching from end to end. At the far side, behind the serving counter, stood a line of American cooks in white aprons, ladles in hand. Steam rose from metal containers. It smelled like another world. The women halted instinctively, unsure if they were allowed to approach. An American sergeant motioned gently. "Line up here," he said, gesturing toward the tray stacked neatly at the front. His voice wasn't cruel, just routine, like a man used to order. Margaret took a tray, her hands shaking so badly that it rattled against the metal stack. The cook, a heavy-set man with a kind face, smiled as he lifted a ladle and poured a thick stream of stew onto her tray. The liquid was dark brown and shimmering with fat, dotted with carrots, potatoes, and unmistakable chunks of beef. She stared at it, speechless. He added 2 thick slices of bread beside the stew, real bread, crust golden, center soft. Marguerite reached for it cautiously, afraid it might crumble into dust. A second cook offered a cup of coffee, the dark liquid sloshing gently. The smell alone made her dizzy. She moved aside to make room for Anna and Elizabeth, who were staring at their trays as though they held treasure. Around them, the other women shuffled through the line in silence, each reaction the same. Shock, disbelief, tears welling in hollowed eyes. They found seats together at a long table. For a long moment, no one moved. The hall was filled with the faint clatter of utensils, the murmur of American voices, and the sound of spoons stirring stew. But the women sat frozen. Margaret lifted her spoon, her hand trembling. She hesitated, her mind flickering through every warning, every lie they had been told. The Americans are monsters. They will make you suffer. They will never feed you. And yet here it was, warmth rising from a bowl, the smell of life itself. She dipped her spoon into the stew, the gravy coating the metal, thick and glossy. The first bite touched her tongue, and her world broke open. The taste was overwhelming. Salty, tender, impossibly rich. The beef melted in her mouth, releasing flavor that seemed to awaken every nerve in her body. She swallowed, feeling the warmth spread through her chest, her stomach, her very bones. It was like remembering how to be human. She took another spoonful, then another. Her vision blurred as tears filled her eyes. Across the table, Anna was doing the same, sobbing quietly as she ate. Elizabeth laughed, an odd, breathless sound, then clutched her stomach, overcome by both joy and pain. But within minutes, the miracle turned into something else. The women began to slow, faces pale, hands pressing to their stomachs. The stew was too rich. Their bodies, starved for so long, couldn't handle the sudden abundance. Marguerite felt a cramp twist deep in her abdomen. She gasped softly, setting her spoon down. "Langsam," she whispered to herself. Slowly. But her body shook with the conflict between hunger and pain. An American corporal noticed. He was young, freckle-faced, his expression full of concern. "You okay?" he asked. When no one answered, he hurried off, returning moments later with Lieutenant Morrison. The lieutenant knelt beside their table, her blue eyes scanning their faces. "You're eating too quickly," she said gently in German. "You must go slow. Small bites, little by little. Your bodies must learn again. She gestured to one of the cooks who brought a pitcher of water and several cups. "Drink," she instructed softly. "Slowly, take your time. There will be food tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that." The words landed like a miracle. There will be food tomorrow. Marguerite sipped the water, the coolness soothing her throat. Around her, the others obeyed, setting down their spoons, breathing through the cramps. The lieutenant stayed with them until their faces relaxed again. Her voice was, 3 weeks had passed since that first miraculous dinner of beef stew, and Camp Gordon had settled into a rhythm that felt almost impossible to believe. The women woke each morning to the sound of a bell, washed in clean water and gathered for breakfast. Oatmeal sweetened with sugar, sometimes even with a drizzle of milk. Real milk. By midday they were given sandwiches filled with cheese and cold cuts, and for dinner there was always something warm. Meatloaf, chicken stew, vegetables, even fruit on occasion. For 38 women who had once starved on potato peel soup and moldy bread, every meal still felt like a small miracle. Their faces began to fill out again, bones softening under skin. Their hair, once dull and brittle, regained a faint sheen. And, for the first time in years, laughter began to reappear. Tentative, fragile, but real. Yet beneath the recovery, something else stirred. A quiet guilt that none of them dared speak aloud. It started subtly, like a shadow creeping at the edges of their comfort. Margaret first noticed it the day the mail arrived. Lieutenant Morrison entered the barracks carrying a bundle of thin envelopes, the Red Cross emblem stamped in red on each. The women gathered, hands trembling with anticipation as names were called one by one. For many, it was the first word from home since their capture. Marguerite's letter was from her younger sister, Heidi, in Hamburg. The handwriting was shaky, the ink faint, and from the very first line, Margaret's breath caught. "Dearest Gret, Mama died in February during the bombing. We buried her in the garden. Father is still alive, but very weak. We have no coal for heat. The rations give us almost nothing now. 100 grams of bread a day, 1 potato when we are lucky. Yesterday, Father gave me his portion. I tried to refuse, but he insisted. We boil grass now to make soup. Please, if you can, send food, even a little." The words blurred as Margaret's tears fell onto the paper. She pressed it to her chest, shaking silently. Around her, the same sounds echoed. Gasps, muffled sobs, whispered prayers. Anna sat nearby, reading her letter aloud in a trembling voice. "My mother says they eat wallpaper paste. It has flour in it. She says not to come home too soon, that there is nothing left to return to." Elizabeth, once the strongest among them, covered her face with both hands, her shoulders quivering. "My brother writes they eat rats," she whispered. "Rats and pigeons. Children too weak to cry anymore." The barracks that had once been filled with cautious joy now felt suffocating. The women who had begun to regain color and strength sat silently on their cots, letters clutched in pale hands, the food in their stomachs turning to stone. That evening, when dinner was served, chicken stew and buttered bread, almost no one ate. Marguerite stared at her tray, her mind replaying Heidi's words. 1 potato, 1 slice of bread. She thought of her father's hollow face, of her mother's grave in the garden. The spoon trembled in her hand. "How can we eat this?" Anna whispered beside her. "When they starve?" No one answered. The stew's aroma, once comforting, now felt obscene. Margaret pushed her tray away, the sight of it making her stomach twist. Days passed. The mess hall, once filled with the gentle clatter of spoons and low conversation, became eerily quiet. Women requested smaller portions. Some hid bread in their pockets, not knowing why, as if instinct told them they should save it for someone who needed it more. Lieutenant Morrison noticed the change almost immediately. She saw it in the returned trays still half full, in the hollow silence that had replaced soft laughter. So one afternoon she called Margaret to her office. The lieutenant's desk was neatly arranged, a small vase of flowers on one corner, a simple touch of normalcy in a world trying to recover from war. Through the open window, Georgia sunlight spilled across the floor, so bright and golden it almost felt cruel. "You received letters from home," Lieutenant Morrison said quietly. More statement than question. Margaret nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "I can only imagine how hard that must be," Morrison continued, "to have enough when your loved ones have nothing." She paused, searching for the right words. But Margaret, starving yourself here will not feed them. Your suffering will not ease theirs. The logic was sound, but logic was powerless against love and guilt. Margaret's throat tightened. My sister eats grass, she said, her German-accented English halting. My father gives her his bread. He is dying, and I eat meat. How is this right? Morrison was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer. It's not right, she admitted. None of this war is. But maybe, just maybe, what you do with your strength can make a difference. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a small folder of papers. The Red Cross is organizing aid efforts, she explained. They need help. People who speak German, people who can write letters, pack supplies, translate information. I can arrange for some of you to help. It won't change everything, but it's something. For the first time in weeks, Marguerite looked up. We can help? Yes, Morrison said. You can use the life you've regained here to give life back, even in small ways. That night, the barracks buzzed softly as Morrison's offer spread. For the first time since the letters had arrived, there was a sense of purpose again. Faint, fragile, but real. The next morning, Margaret and several others were escorted to a Red Cross. By the time the Red Cross work became routine, 2 months had passed since that first meal of beef stew. The women of Camp Gordon had transformed, not just physically, but spiritually. Faces once gaunt were now soft and warm with life. Voices once subdued by fear now carried laughter. And hands that once trembled from weakness now packed crates of food destined for the starving families of Europe. But even as they worked, a quiet anxiety began to spread, a whisper in the barracks that grew louder with each passing day. When do we go home? The war in Europe had ended on May 8, 1945. News of Germany's surrender had swept through the camp like a storm. American guards cheered. The mess hall erupted in celebration, and for the first time in years, the women dared to believe that the world might finally stop burning. Yet the victory also brought a new kind of uncertainty. If the war was over, what did that mean for them? Repatriation. The word began appearing in morning briefings and on bulletin boards. Male German soldiers in nearby camps were already being processed for return. Trucks came and went, filled with men bound for the ports at Charleston and New York, where ships waited to carry them back to the ruins of their homeland. For the women, the question hung heavy in the air. They were soldiers too, even if their uniforms had been skirts instead of trousers. Logic said they would be next. But logic did little to ease the dread that now took root in their hearts. One evening in late June, the women gathered in their barracks for what became an unspoken council. A meeting of souls too burdened to sleep. The Georgia sky outside glowed orange and purple with sunset, and the cicadas hummed like the restless beating of time. Elizabeth Hartman, once their most stoic member, stood by the window. The sunlight caught her hair, now shining again after months of proper nourishment. When we return, she said quietly, we return to hunger. Her voice trembled, but she continued. You've all read your letters. You know what waits for us there. Ruins, disease, starvation. I've seen the Red Cross reports, only they say more Germans are dying now than before the surrender. Dying because there is no food left. Anna, sitting cross-legged on her cot, nodded slowly. My mother wrote again, she said. She says not to come home. She says I would only be another mouth they cannot feed. Marguerite sat in silence, staring at the folded letter she had read 100 times. Heidi's words replayed endlessly. Please, if you can, send food. Even a little. Each repetition carved deeper into her conscience. Elizabeth's eyes moved across the room, meeting each woman's gaze. When we return, she whispered, we will become what we were before. Hungry, hollow, desperate. Except now we will know what it feels like to be full. The words hit like a hammer. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Anna's voice, fragile but steady, broke the silence. Maybe we don't have to go back. Heads turned. Shock, disbelief, hope, all flickered across the faces in that small wooden room. Stay? Elizabeth asked softly. In America? Anna nodded. My mother said if there's any ways, I should take it. That survival matters more than pride. No one laughed. No one dismissed the idea. They all knew the truth. In post-war Germany, survival itself had become a luxury. Over the next few days, whispers turned into plans. They spoke in cautious tones whenever guards were out of earshot, discussing possibilities they barely dared to imagine. Could they stay as refugees? Could they work with the Red Cross? Would America allow them, former enemies, to live on its soil? Margaret lay awake night after night, torn between guilt and longing. She wanted to see Heidi again, to help her, to bury her father properly. But what good would that do if she arrived home only to starve beside them? And so, when the orders finally came, repatriation July 15, 1945, the women moved like ghosts. Their cots were stripped, their few belongings packed. New dresses donated by local churches replaced the worn German uniforms. They looked more like civilians now, but the weight in their eyes betrayed the truth. At dawn, trucks rumbled outside the barracks, engines idling. The air smelled faintly of diesel and dust. Lieutenant Morrison entered quietly, her posture as straight as always, but her expression softer than usual. "It's time," she said in German. "The transport is waiting." The women stood in silence, gathering their things. Some clutched letters. Others carried small keepsakes, a rosary, a ribbon, a photograph. Margaret folded her hands around Heidi's latest note, the paper worn thin from constant reading. As they filed into line, Anna Fisher hesitated. Then, with sudden courage, she stepped out of formation and faced Lieutenant Morrison. "Excuse me, Lieutenant," she said in careful English, her voice trembling. "May I ask, is it possible not to go?" The words hung in the air like gunfire. Morrison blinked. "Not to go?" "Yes," Anna said, clutching her letter. If I stay here, will they let me? My mother says there is nothing left, no food. She says not to come." Her voice cracked. "If I return, I die." A ripple went through the line of women. Elizabeth stepped forward next, holding her own letter. "My brother wrote the same. He said I would only be another burden." And then, one by one, the relief was instant, overwhelming. The women exhaled as if they had been holding their breath for days. Tears flowed freely. It wasn't freedom yet, but it was time. Time to hope. Time to live. Time to believe that survival might still be possible. Days turned into weeks after Captain Wheeler's decision, and still no orders came from Washington. Bureaucracy, it seemed, was a strange kind of mercy. The women of Camp Gordon continued their work with the Red Cross, sorting boxes of powdered milk and canned meat, writing careful letters in German to accompany aid parcels bound for their homeland. Each morning, the same sun rose over the Georgia fields, spilling gold over the wire fences and guard towers that no longer felt like cages. The American soldiers now greeted them by name. They shared jokes, cigarettes, and sometimes even stories about their own families. The air in camp had changed, no longer enemy and captor, but human to human. Lieutenant Morrison visited often, her uniform always immaculate, her presence both firm and kind. She had become more than an officer. She was the bridge between two worlds. It was Morrison who taught the women English phrases, who corrected their grammar gently, who reminded them that dignity was not surrendered in defeat. Margaret had grown stronger. Her once hollow cheeks now carried color again, and she no longer stumbled when she walked. She helped oversee the Red Cross translation tables, her handwriting neat and careful. Yet every evening as the sun set behind the Georgia hills, she would sit outside the barracks, reading her sister's last letter over and over. "Please send food if you can." She couldn't. But she prayed that one of the boxes she packed might somehow find its way to Hamburg. That somewhere across the ocean, Heidi might open it and taste even a fraction of the mercy Margaret had received. One afternoon, Morrison entered the workroom holding a folder. Her face was serious, but her eyes, those steady, intelligent eyes, held a glimmer of warmth. "The War Department has replied," she said in German. The room fell silent. "The official stance is that all prisoners are to be repatriated to Germany," she continued slowly. A murmur of despair rippled through the women. But Morrison wasn't finished. "However," she added, "exceptions may be considered on humanitarian grounds. You may apply for sponsorship through approved organizations, churches, hospitals, or aid groups. It is not guaranteed, but it is possible." The word struck like thunder. Marguerite's heart leapt and sank all at once. To stay meant safety, food, maybe even a future, but it also meant leaving her family behind, possibly forever. That night, the barracks glowed dimly with oil lamps as the women debated in whispers. Some clung to the idea of home, however broken it was. Others, like Anna, spoke with quiet conviction. "My mother released me," she said. "She said if I survive, then I honor her. If I die, what purpose did any of it serve?" Elizabeth, ever the voice of reason, nodded solemnly. We must each decide what survival means. Some of us will return. Some will stay. Both choices will hurt. Margaret could barely sleep. She turned over her sister's letter again and again, tracing the faded ink with her fingertips. Even a little would save lives. Those words became her compass. The following morning she went to Morrison's office. The lieutenant looked up from her desk, surprised but not unkind. Margaret, she said softly, I wondered when you'd come. I want to apply, Margaret said in halting English. To stay, if allowed. Morrison studied her for a long moment. You understand it may take months. You might still be sent home in the meantime. Yes, Margaret said, but if there is even a chance, I must try. The lieutenant nodded and handed her a form. You'll need a sponsor. I can contact the Red Cross director in Atlanta. They are expanding their medical relief program and may take nurses. A flicker of something, gratitude, disbelief, maybe hope, passed through Marguerite's eyes. Danke, she whispered. Word spread quickly. Over the next week, nearly 24 of the women applied for sponsorships. Churches in Georgia, Texas, and the Carolinas agreed to review their cases. A few American doctors wrote letters of recommendation, praising the women's work ethic and skill in the medical tents. The camp became a place suspended between two worlds, not quite Germany, not yet America. Each passing day felt like a coin flipping in the air, fate waiting to decide which side it would land on. By September 1945, the first approvals arrived. Anna Fisher was among them. She had been accepted into a relief nursing program in Atlanta, sponsored by a Methodist mission. When Morrison gave her the news, Anna wept, not from joy alone, but from the unbearable mixture of freedom and guilt. Marguerite's name was on the second list. The American Red Cross had agreed to take her on probationary terms as a medical assistant. When she read the letter, her hands trembled so violently that she had to set it down. For a long moment, she could only stare at the words, Provisional Placement, Camp Gordon Applicant. On October 3rd, she packed her few belongings once again. But this time there was no line of trucks, no barbed wire, no forced return. Morrison met her at the gate, the morning light soft and golden around them. You've earned this, the lieutenant said quietly. Make it mean something. Margaret nodded, tears filling her eyes. I will. As she stepped out of Camp Gordon, the sound of cicadas swelled in the distance, the same hum that had filled her first night there months ago. Only now it sounded less like captivity and more like life itself. Behind her, the camp still buzzed with movement, women preparing for their own uncertain futures. Some would stay, others would go, but all of them would carry the same memory. The night an American officer said, beef stew tonight, and kindness began to rewrite the end of their war. Years later, long after the war had faded into history books and memories, Margaret would still remember the smell. Not of gunpowder or fear, but of beef stew. That first bowl had not simply fed her hunger. It had rewritten what she believed about enemies, mercy, and survival. The Americans had every reason to hate them, every reason to turn away. Yet they chose compassion, and that choice had changed everything. Margaret's life in America became a quiet one. She never returned to Germany. By the time she could have, her sister and father had both died of starvation. She buried that grief in her work, caring for refugees and orphans who had fled a Europe in ruins. She wore no uniform now, only a Red Cross badge and the memory of a lieutenant who had once said, use your strength to help them. And she did. For 30 years, she served in relief hospitals, sending food and medicine to the same country that had once sent her to war. When people asked where her compassion came from, she would smile faintly and say, from a bowl of soup in Georgia. War had taken almost everything from her, her youth, her homeland, her family. But in the ashes, it had also given her something she had never expected, proof that kindness could survive even the end of civilization. She died peacefully in 1978 in a small Georgia town, surrounded by nurses she had trained, none of whom knew she had once been their enemy. Her gravestone bore a simple inscription, Sister Margaret Schultz, she chose to heal. And in the camp records that still survive, one entry remains under her name, written in faded ink by Lieutenant Patricia Morrison herself. No longer a prisoner, now a nurse, alive and free, If you believe stories like this, remind the world that even in war, compassion matters, and share this story. Because history isn't only about who fought or who won. Sometimes it's about who chose to feed the hungry when no one else would.